Physiology. Um, most ology study of, physio, it's kind of a vague thing to be. Physio is more like just means nature, study of nature. But in reality, when we talk about physiology, more specifically, what are we actually studying? Especially in particularly human physiology. What are we actually going to be studying for the next 4 months?
Function.
Functions.
Function. So this is like study of the function. Um, and obviously you can't study function without actually looking at the actual parts and pieces of the body and how it's put together. And it'd be like if you were trying to understand. I'm going to understand how a car engine works. You're not going to understand how a car engine works if you don't know what a piston and a cylinder and a spark plug and things like that are. So we have to also look at the structure. So and that obviously is anatomy. Which is the study of the structure. And physiology and anatomy are very much intertwined. People talk about the complementarity of structure and function. Complementary. Right, in anatomy, you didn't just learn, oh, here is the heart, and here is a ventricle, and here is a valve. You learned, like, that would be boring. Like, but what is the heart doing? You talked about the heart being a pump, which is generating the pressure that pushes the blood through your cardiovascular system. The same thing in physiology. Physiology isn't going to make any sense if we don't talk about the anatomy to some degree. The difference between anatomy and physiology is kind of more the focus, where we're going to put most of our energy. Like in anatomy, you put more time and energy into the details of describing the structures. Every little thing gets a little name. And you talk about its functional anatomy, you talk about the function, but up to a point. You don't get into really excruciating details about the function. You'll talk about, oh, here is a neurotransmitter binding a receptor on a neuron, but leave it there. In physiology, it's going to be the opposite. We're going to have to talk about the structure. We'll have to talk about neurons and synapses and, the brain and the heart and ventricles and this and that, but we're going to focus in on much more of the function, the chemistry and the physics, the fluid dynamics, like what are the things that adjust blood pressure and allow your body to maintain its blood pressure. What is going on when a neurotransmitter or a hormone binds a receptor at a molecular level? What kind of things are going on that actually causes a change inside the cell from some little thing floating and touching it on the outside of its membrane? So physiology and anatomy complementary, but we are going to focus in on the function during the course of this semester. If you've taken anatomy, there'll be a lot of stuff that's going to feel kind of familiar. And when we're talking about function, I should mention we can talk about kind of a mechanistic description of function or a teleological. So teleology, this is kind of the why. Mechanistic is kind of what is happening. A classic example of this is like sweating, for instance. Like a mechanistic description would be you have temperature receptors that are, if your body temperature is starting to go up, It turns on these circuits in your nervous system that activate sweat glands and cause them to secrete sweat on your skin. That's kind of what is happening. There is this process where increasing temperature turns on these sweat glands to secrete sweat. But why? What's the point? This one's pretty easy. This one we can say, well, it helps with evaporative cooling. When you're heating up, that sweating is going to then cause this moisture on your skin, which evaporates, and the evaporation takes up heat and helps cool you down. So the why in this case is pretty straightforward. Sometimes the why is going to be easy. Sometimes the why is going to not be easy. There's going to be stuff we're going to talk about where you're going to say, well, why is it like that? And we're going to have to say, because it is. Who knows? Even some like really basic things like fever. Like when you get sick, your body is fighting something. Your white blood cells release signaling molecules that talk to your hypothalamus in your brain and reset your core body temperature to a higher temperature than normal. Exactly why that is useful in fighting something, there are different hypotheses, but nobody has a super clear explanation. For sweating, I can say I feel pretty comfortable that we sweat to help with temperature regulation because evaporative cooling helps cool us off when we're hot. Exactly why we have a fever when we are sick, that one I would not be so bold as to give you any definitive explanation of why that's useful. I could tell you some of the hypotheses that people think why it's useful, but there's nothing so obvious like sweating cools you off. So just putting that out there. And sometimes the why is not so obvious. And sometimes the why is probably more just, it's kind of left over through the course of evolution. It ended up like that and it wasn't maladaptive, so it's still like that. But it's not like that for any like positive reason. It's more kind of lack of a negative reason. So kind of putting that out there. What else? Every science class probably in your life starts with levels of organization, so this should be no different. I always think about this in math. Every math class I took for from elementary school through grad school was always, we start with sets. In biology, we always start with levels of organization. I think it's useful just to give you an orientation of how we're approaching this class. Obviously, atoms and molecules, this kind of chemical level is at the base. And we are going to spend a lot of time here to understand what's going on in the body and in cells. You really do need to understand what's going on at this level. What do we get once we have atoms and molecules put together into the basic unit of life?
Organelles.
Say it again. Cells, and we get cells.
Organelles.
Right. The next level are the cells. In the cells, your body is made out of trillions and trillions of cells. And they are all working together. You are not just like trillions of amoebas in a bucket. You have all these trillions of cells that somehow all coordinate to make this, we'll talk about in general, you can think of you as a single organism. We're going to have to understand how a cell works and how cells do their thing and how cells coordinate with other cells to start understanding the larger picture. We are going to spend the first month of this class just at this level, atoms and molecules and cells. We're not going to get to our first system until like a month into the class, where we're going to start actually finally putting together these basic concepts into these larger ideas of system organs and things like that. So cells, obviously, then we get to tissues. Tissues are just a variety of similar cells doing similar function. If you've been in anatomy, you know there's epithelial tissue, which kind of lines and covers things. We will spend quite a bit of time focusing in on epithelial tissues because those are creating the boundaries between inside and outside. These are regulating what makes it into your body, what stays outside of your body. This is where the first vanguard against invaders coming in is going to exist. So epithelial tissues actually will be quite, we'll have a spotlight on epithelial tissues as we go through the semester. Muscle tissue, the contractile tissue, we'll definitely be spending quite a bit of time looking at that as well. The different kinds, the smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle. Again, it's excitable and contracts, squeezes, pulls. Nervous tissue. We'll be spending a lot of time looking at nervous tissue. To really understand what's going on in the nervous system, you really want to start understanding what is a neuron and how do neurons talk to other neurons and how do glial cells adjust what's going on in the neurons and things like that. So we'll be spending quite a bit of time looking at nervous tissue in detail. Connective tissue. This one is important, but this is one that we're not going to be spending as much of a focus on in our class. Connective tissue is basically cells with kind of some extracellular matrix scattered around in between. It would be your bone tissue or your cartilage or just all of the irregular, dense connective tissue or loose connective tissue. There's all sorts of connective tissue holding things together, wrapping things, giving things structure, protecting things. For the most part, we're not going to be getting into that. The only connective tissues that we'll look at in real detail will be like the blood and the lymph, which are also considered connective tissues since they're kind of loosely scattered cells in some matrix. In the case of blood, it's a fluid matrix called the plasma. So tissues. Two or more tissues which are together in a structure for a common function is an
Organ.
An organ. So the next level is the organ. Like the heart, right? The heart is made out of epithelial tissue, both lining the inside of the chambers as well as creating the serous membranes on the outside of it. It's made out of cardiac muscle to do the squeezing, nervous tissue to coordinate all of the contraction, connective tissue to give it structural integrity, and all working together for a common goal of sending, pushing your blood through your body. And then we go into the organ systems. Like the cardiovascular system or the respiratory system or the endocrine system. Like I mentioned earlier, I'll mention again right now, this is actually pretty artificial. It's a good starting point. When you're first learning this stuff, it kind of helps, it stops everything from happening all at once. Even though in reality, everything is happening all at once in your body. But in the beginning, it's good to kind of limit the scope of things, so you don't have, so you can kind of start with kind of a simpler description, but then expand it out and see how things are all interrelated. Like again, like the example I was giving was, you think about, like, the urinary system, the kidneys are the main arbiter of your blood pressure by adjusting fluid levels in your body. They're also the main thing doing pH balance in your body. Um, they're also going to be critical for making sure your nervous system and muscles are working right by adjusting electrolyte levels in your body. You can't really tease these things apart at the deepest levels because everything is all interrelated with each other. So, which is, it'll be fun as that, and it's also part of the reason why we're not starting with a system. We're starting with cells, because at the core, it's a whole bunch of cells all working together for a common goal of being you. And this goes to the organism, which is you. I typically, part of the reason, it's like you might say, well, duh, of course it's an organism. But the reason I'm putting this here and making it like highlighted is I want you to keep perspective that, especially in the beginning, you might be feeling like, why are we spending all this time looking at like ionic versus covalent bonds, or whether or not this thing is polar or non-polar, or solubility, or blah blah blah. Ultimately, it is going to all come back to understanding the organism. So all of the stuff we're doing down at this level is ultimately in service of building this bigger picture that's going to help us understand the whole organism. Like if you're trying to figure out like why are you kind of calmer if you're taking Ativan or Valium, it comes down to little anions crossing a membrane and changing voltages in neurons and things like that. You really are going to have a basic understanding of processes at this level to understand what's going on at this level, the level of the organism. So, and then obviously this levels of organization continues on. Organisms are in groups called communities, and then communities of, or no, what is it, populations, and then populations are in communities, and communities are in ecosystems, and blah blah blah. But for our purposes, we'll be kind of stopping here at the organism. All right, where are we in terms of time? All right, so last thing I'd like to kind of end with right now is another one of these common introductory or start every biology class with. Levels of organization you almost always start with. The other one that you almost always start with is homeostasis. Which is going to be a recurring theme in this class. What is homeostasis? Anybody? I know you've seen this before in lots of classes.
Is the balance in your body fluids, like your cells? Like let's say if you have too much salts in your body, your cells started to shrink, or it's gonna bust. It
So,
just helps the balance.
right. So What she's, due to, we're going to talk about osmosis in a lot of detail, but if the salt levels in your body are not right, your cells are going to either explode or shrivel. So you've got to make sure the electrolyte salt levels are just at the right value. And not just salt levels, you got to make sure your temperature is at the right level. You got to make sure that your pH is at the right level. You've got to make sure that your water levels are at the right level. There's all these things that need to be kind of maintained at the kind of correct balanced level. So, homeostasis, we often say, like, kind of maintain a stable kind of internal
Environment.
environment. You know, make sure that, again, salt levels, temperature levels, pH levels, whatever levels are staying where they should be. And if they go up, you bring them back down. If they go down, you bring them back up. Um, it's hard for me to, I don't speak French, so, but I will try. La fixité du milieu intérieur est la condition d'une vie libre et indépendante. So this was this guy, Claude Bernard, in the mid 1800s, was the one who first kind of came up with this. It means the constancy of the internal environment is a condition for a free and independent life, right? Because we can go into any kind of environment, external environment, but we have all these processes going on in our body that make sure all our cells have what they need. We don't have to, like, a lizard's going to move someplace warmer, someplace colder, or, different kind of creatures have to just make sure they go the place that is going to make sure that everything's okay for them. We humans live in the craziest places, live in the farthest north frozen tundras, in hot steaming jungles, like, everywhere, and manage to pull it off because they have this amazing ability to just adjust and keep their internal body stable and healthy, even though outside is doing who knows what. Most homeostatic mechanisms rely on what's called negative feedback, so we should talk about that. So let me talk about negative feedback mechanisms. So, oops, hold on, I need a change here. All right, so negative feedback. Negative feedback. So there's some variable. Let's say this variable is your temperature. Or maybe it's your salt levels. Or it's your pH. It's something that you want to control and keep at a stable value. Negative feedback means that when there is some change in the variable, maybe let me type it, it'll be quicker. So basically, when there is a change in the variable, the response that happens opposes that change. So, for instance, if your temperature is going up, the response is going to be to try to bring it back down, like sweating. If your temperature is going down, the response is going to be to try to warm you back up, like shivering, for instance. Right? So this idea that negative feedback, this variable is moving in one direction, and then there is some response now that tries to push it back to its kind of set point. If it goes down, the response is going to be to try to push it back up. So that's this idea of negative feedback. So does that make sense? I mean, we're going to see this constantly. And again, a lot of disease conditions happen when there's a breakdown in this process. And things, some variables, one of these parameters in your body is no longer at this optimal value, and the processes that are supposed to bring it back into line are not functioning properly. You're sick. Just for completeness, there are two other types of things that we'll see. I should say rarely there is positive feedback. So positive feedback is when the response actually intensifies the change. So like I said, this is rare, but it happens in a few cases that we are going to see. For instance, in blood clotting, when you have platelets that are starting to deal with a tear in a blood vessel, they start sending out messages that bring more platelets in, which send messages that bring even more platelets in, and all the platelets start sandbagging in there and stop the blood from leaking out. Obviously, there has to be a stop point, right? Your blood doesn't just keep doing this until your blood all turns into some sludge. But, at least the first part of this process is positive feedback. Or in birth, childbirth. As labor, as the uterine contractions begin, that actually causes the release of more oxytocin from your pituitary gland, which intensifies the contractions, which actually causes even more release of oxytocin, which makes even stronger contractions. This is when a woman's going into labor. The squeezing gets harder and harder and harder and harder. Obviously that has to have an endpoint. In this case, the baby pops out, and so rare, but you still should know that it exists because we'll see it.
But can I just ask a clarifying question about that?
Sure.
So the positive feedback is, for example, if your blood was clotting and then it just kept clotting, or the positive feedback is the endpoint?
No, the positive feedback is the mechanism where you have a platelet. A platelet is the little thing in your blood that is starting this process.
Mm-hmm.
And it sends out signaling molecules that attract more platelets. And so those platelets come into the scene and start dogpiling. And then those platelets then send out messages that attract even more platelets. And then those platelets come in and add to the big dog pile we call the platelet plug that is kind of blocking the blood from leaking out there.
Okay, thank you.
The one last thing I will mention, you can also have feed-forward mechanisms. So feed-forward, this anticipates a change in a variable. So anticipates, meaning the change hasn't happened yet. So you have a response to something that actually hasn't happened yet, but you're pretty sure is going to happen. Example, there's what we call the cephalic phase of gastric secretion. if you just are about to eat, you are hungry and you've got a big plate of food in front of you and you're about to start eating it, your stomach glands will already start secreting acids and digestive enzymes before any food has hit your mouth. It's anticipating pretty soon the food's going to hit the stomach and we're going to need all the gastric juices, but it's going to show up initially before any food has entered. If you are, I don't know if people have ever noticed, if you're like about to vomit, often you get saliva start pouring into your mouth ahead of time, basically to protect your teeth and stuff from the acid that's about to come spewing through your mouth from your stomach. Feed forward. If you think about lemons, if you think about chewing a lemon like in your mouth, like imagine what would it be like to just chew straight into a lemon. You'll probably notice that you're starting to get saliva pouring into your mouth, even though you haven't actually got that sour lemon in your mouth yet. But all of a sudden, you're going to like, whoa, I actually have more spit in my mouth than I had a moment ago. That's feed forward. So the body is responding to something that hasn't happened yet, but is probably going to be happening. So just kind of putting that out there, feed forward. But like I mentioned, the star of our class is going to definitely be negative feedback. This is going to be the majority of the things that we're going to be looking at, negative feedback. So any questions about this kind of really kind of basic stuff here, or the class in general?